Hi, this is Chris Spedding with John on Retrospectives on 3SER KC Radio.
You began on the violin, I believe.
Yes, when I was 9 years old.
How serious did that get?
Not that serious, because I wasn't really exposed to rock and roll until, when I was 9, that was 1953. So it wasn't really any rock and roll. And my parents never used to play any, they wouldn't even play jazz or like Frank Sinatra or anything. And it was always the classical station on the radio, you know. So I didn't even have an experience of anything with a beat, as it were, not even jazz or pop music. So when I became exposed to rock and roll, I sort of had a total epiphany, as it were. And didn't want anything further to do with the violin, so I was a bit of a rebel from day one, as it were, you know. When I suppose you know about the skiffle boom in...
Oh, yeah.
I'm a sort of child of that, you know, along the same generation as the Beatles and everything. I'm kind of from their sort of era, sort of age-wise. And so I was exposed to a lot of the same sort of things that they were. And I was only about a few dozen miles away in Sheffield. They used to get all the latest American records first in Liverpool, being a port. But we used to get them sort of second-hand, as it were, you know. The Bo Diddley records, the Chuck Berry records, and Muddy Waters records, all those chess things. Actually, I was living in Birmingham. The family moved to Birmingham for a couple of years when I was first exposed to that. And then we moved back to Sheffield, where I was born, when I was about 14. So I have memories of... I've just recently been in touch with some friends on the internet who tell me that just below my year in school, were quite a few people in Birmingham, like Roy Wood, who became who formed Wizard and was in Move. Was a year below us. Bevan, who I think was in the Electric Light Orchestra. All these guys I was at school with, I didn't even know about, because of course they, you know, I'd moved out of Birmingham. So I wasn't in touch with them.
Yeah.
I didn't even know Joe Cocker when he was in Sheffield. He was active around that time. Dave Berry was the only local Sheffield guy that I used to go and watch. I don't know whether you know about him in Australia. He had a big hit with the original Crying Game in the 60s.
Of course.
The original version of it. And he was a big local rock star.
Now, I believe you were in a country and western band in your early days. Was that a career direction you were keen on? It comes under the heading of let me try and broaden myself, you know. I'd sort of figured I'd had a crash course in jazz and the blues, you know, because I was having lessons from this jazz guy. Of course, my first sort of thing was the Shadows and all that sort of stuff after the skiffle. But then my parents, in disgust, sent me to, when they realised I wasn't going to be a violinist, they sent me to, and I got fired from the school orchestra for you know, I had this thing where I'd really play up, I'd detune the strings and then play the part properly, so that the conductor, the music teacher, would be watching everybody playing, seeing where the fingering was, seeing where the funny sound was coming from. And of course, I was playing the part properly with the right fingering, but I'd detuned the violin, so it sounded awful. When he eventually figured out, he was so pissed off with me that he fired me. So that was my start in my music career. So I always thought it was really funny. Somebody who was going to be a professional musician, that's how they started. So, what was the question again? The country and western band. I guess it would have been important, I guess, as your grounding as a musician, to be playing in various styles.
After doing all the other stuff, I thought, oh well, what do I need to learn now? And I saw the ad in the Melody Maker for this country western outfit, and I thought, oh yeah, I don't know much about that. Let's join that band and I'll learn that. So that was kind of the reason for it. And I kind of got into Chet Atkins and stuff, and who I'd never heard before, and I enjoyed, you know, I got my first exposure to Hank Williams and Johnny Cash and people like that. So that was fun. And also it gave me my first taste of what it might be like to live in America, because we used to go and play at the US Air Force bases. That was the little circuit that we worked on. And of course, as soon as you go into a US Air Force base, you're basically on American soil legally.
everything, even the Coca-Cola, is flown in from America and it tastes different, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, the 7-Up tasted different, you know, and of course it was all American beer, which at that time, we're talking like 1962, you couldn't really go and buy a Budweiser in England, you know, or anything except a British beer. It was all very sort of parochial in those days, and this was like flying to America, and all you'd done is gone to Ruislip Air Force Base. So that was a kind of a foretaste of things to come, you know. So I became a fan of all things American. As after being a fan of their music, I became a fan of the lifestyle, and of course there was all sorts of horrible things in England, like, you know, the bars closing at 11 o'clock, and, you know, very sort of seemed very limited. Like, it seems like we were still living in the war, where we had to sort of make sacrifices in our lifestyles because you know, keep the upper lip, you know, stiff upper lip and all that, you know. Didn't really go down well with me when I saw the sort of land of plenty that the USA was. In fact, that was probably the reason why I became an expatriate. You know, I experienced that when I came to Australia, which I actually did. If you've got my bio, does it say anything about me on the boat, the SS Himalaya?
It does ring a bell, yeah.
Yeah, because that's when I first came to Australia. It's my first professional job as a ship's musician.
Oh, yes.
During the days when Australia was had an immigration policy, you know, that they used to subsidise British people coming over.
Yep.
I had a friend who I used to share a flat with. He just couldn't get work, and so he applied for it. You know, for about £10, he was able to get a passage, and he's still in Australia. So I came over. We docked at Sydney. We went to, I think, the West Coast as well, Adelaide or Perth, something like that. So I had my first experience of Australia, and that was quite an eye-opener, because the Australians had a much better lifestyle than we did in Britain. Being the mother country, that was quite a wake-up call, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
First threw yourself into session work. How difficult was it to gain notoriety, and was it terribly competitive amongst musicians to get the work?
Well, to tell you the truth, although I started out on a violin, and so I had a nodding acquaintance with the dots, you know, being able to read music, I never really thought I had what it took, because I figured you had to be able to sight read on sight, you know. But in actual fact, when you get to a session, you have a few minutes to look at something, and you can ask some guy sitting next to you, the bass player or the other guitar player, hey, what does that bit, you know, can you sing me this difficult-looking bit? And they'll sing you it, and you'll be able to play it by ear, because they had a much better ear than I did have sight-reading ability. I never really thought that I had the what it took. But when I came along, I was at a lucky time. It was when Jimmy Page left the session field to form Led Zeppelin, and the other guy, Big Jim Sullivan, had left to come to Las Vegas to play with Tom Jones. So there was two major session stars there, and there was a huge gap, and so they were looking for people. And so I got some calls, and I remember privately thinking, when I was writing down the call, you know, in the studio and the time and everything, so I wonder how they found out about me, because I never said I could do this stuff. I never said I could read it. So their own fault if I can't do it. And I went on along with that attitude. Well, here I am, you know. I'll do what I can do. I never said I could do this shit. And if I fall flat on my face, it's not my fault, you know. So I went in with that sort of attitude, which kind of gave me a bit of confidence, or a bit of attitude, as it were. And I think they liked the way that I adapted the part that was printed in front of me, and adapted it to rock and roll guitar, which I figured what they wanted. So, of course, if you have a very adept and a very accomplished guitar player who would play exactly what was put in front of him, it wouldn't sound like rock and roll, if you can imagine that. It would sound very sort of studied and not really what they wanted. I wasn't like that. I was a little bit of a hooligan, and I had a little bit of an attitude, and much to my surprise, that is exactly what they wanted. So that's the story there. I never really went into it as a competitive thing. I thought, well, this is what I do. If you don't like it, you can lump it. And they liked it. So I wasn't really that competitive in that way. A lot of my colleagues were actually quite competitive, and they would actually be better than me at reading, and more accomplished with their technique and stuff. And they would be sitting there on second guitar, on playing an acoustic part, and I'd be wailing away on lead. and I'd often wonder what they thought of it, you know, because I knew they were probably better than I was, but I was a guy with the attitude.
Yeah.
So that's the story there.
Looking back, do you have a best and worst session, one that you'll never forget and one that you wish you'd never done?
Oh, there's a lot that I wish I'd never done because I played a huge amount of rubbish. You know, I didn't choose the sessions, they chose me.
Yeah.
I just came along and did the best that I could. I remember, like, on a session where I'm thinking, oh, this is just like musical prostitution. I thought, you know, like, this is terrible, you know, like, I can't wait to get out of here, you know, but this is my livelihood. And I thought, well, these guys have asked me to do this. They're paying me well, so I at least owe it to them. You know, the professionalism kicked in.
Yeah.
At least I owe it to them to do a good job. And usually what I would do, I would sort of like find something in the music that would interest me. Find one lick or one way of playing a lick or some chord or like some approach that would absorb me, so that I wouldn't sort of be too get all bitter about it and twisted, you know, and bored. I would try and sort of, you know, the work ethic of the artisan came in, you know, like, let's try and do as good a job as I possibly can, and just concentrate on that. And I'll try and not to concentrate too much on the fact that this is a Kellogg's commercial, you know, and it just could be anybody that they called.
Yeah.
So that's what I used to do, and that got me by quite a lot of stuff. Plus the fact that I was always doing my own little thing all the time. I would always be going out and playing with jazz people or with interesting people like Jack Bruce. I would be doing my own albums where I would write my own songs, so that, you know, a lot of session guys used to think, that my lick was the reason that was a hit, you know, and I never got anything out of it, you know, like I could make my own hit record, but, you know, I never get the chance. Well, I did have a chance, and I realized how difficult it was for a session guy to go in the studio and make a hit record. I tried 2 albums with Harvest. The album's called Backward Progression and The Only Lick I Know, which I basically, although I had some executive producer help, I basically produced them myself. Realized that I needed some help, and that's when and I'll backtrack in a bit. I also left the session field for 2 years to join the Sharks, which was not a success. So I was a success as a session guy, but not whenever I tried to branch out. Yeah. Up until when the Sharks broke up and I went to Mickey Mouse with motorbiking, I thought I'd better get a decent producer, and I hit gold with that one. So I've actually been pretty lucky, really, as a session guy. Not all session guys get to have their own hit record.
Just a couple of other bands you were involved with, the Battered Ornaments. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, they were the reason I got signed up to EMI to do those aforementioned solo albums, Backward Progression and Only Lick I Know. It came about because, it's before I started doing sessions. I was in the Battered Ornaments. Pete Brown, the lyricist for Jack Bruce's Songs with the Cream, was forming a group, and I knew a few sort of jazz people. And at that time, in the late 60s, a lot of jazz people were getting fed up with jazz because it wasn't the cutting edge anymore. Even people like Miles Davis were sounding more like Sly Stone, you know. Mm-hmm. With the Bitches Blues thing, it was more like, you know, I think I'd rather listen to a Sly Stone album than that, you know. It wasn't the same as what Miles Davis had always been doing previously, which was quite cutting-edge jazz. So a lot of those people that I knew, that I was involved with, were looking to form, you know, groups with a sort of, it wasn't called fusion in those days, it was called jazz rock. And I guess we were kind of forming a group that was a bit like the Mothers of Invention, very sort of iconoclastic, you know. And that was the group that we formed, with George Kahn. Dick Hextall Smith was the original sax player. So yeah, that was the Battered Ornaments with Pete Brown as a lead singer. We did one album with Pete Brown, and then we started to do another one, and we sort of got a bit sort of cocky, decided that Pete Brown wasn't a good enough singer, and we fired him, which left me as the guy to do the vocals on the album, and they were all in the wrong key for me, but I didn't know any better. But that was my debut as a singer, doing an album. You know, I had no experience singing live or in clubs. I was singing all these songs that we'd got backing tracks for that were in Pete Brown's key, and I was singing them because I wanted the album to come out, because of the work ethic thing. You know, I wasn't going to let. The group broke up, and we were left with an obligation to provide albums for EMI Harvest, and I was the only one with enough ambition and gumption to take them up. So I walked right into a record deal right there, more or less by default.
And so Nucleus.
Nucleus, that was just after the Bat and Ornaments. That was happening all around the same time that we're breaking up. I guess because of all the jazz people I knew and the interest in jazz fusion, or jazz rock as they called it in those days. I was one of the few guys around that could play rock and roll guitar but could also relate to the jazz guys. So I was first called for a lot of those people, like Mike Westbrook, Mike Gibbs, and Ian Carr's Nucleus. So I was happy to go and do that because I figured I could show them how to play rock and roll, all these jazz guys. I was the only guy in that group, the original lineup, who had a rock and roll background at all. They were all the rest of them jazz guys. Jeff Klein, the bass player, it's his first time he'd played electric bass. He used to play stand-up bass before. And John Marshall was a jazz drummer. And Carl Jenkins is now very famous as a composer with his stuff. You might have heard his instrumental stuff, but he was the original writer for Nucleus. And I thought it was a really good experience, I thought. And looking back, that's about the only valid sort of jazz stuff that first album, Elastic Rock, and the title track, Elastic Rock, is one of the few examples of me playing jazz. As opposed to playing rock and roll with a jazz background, I'm actually playing a jazz solo on that track. So it's a bit like Jim Hall or somebody, looking back on it. So I'm glad I did it because it was a very unique thing. And that first album I thought was very good, that Elastic Rock album.
Moving on to your solo work, how much do you think your previous session playing experience helped you in terms of working relationship with the session musicians on your work?
Well, it meant I was able to know who the right guys were to book. Like on my Hurt album, I booked Herbie Flowers on bass and Glenn Gattini on drums because I'd played with the Vibrators prior to that, and I had some tapes of some really great performances, and I wanted to be put on the album really faithfully, and I knew that Herbie and Clem would be able to read a chart. If I scored out what the Vibrators had done in a chart, a musical chart, the score, Clem and Herbie would be able to read that without sounding like they were reading. So that they were good in that way. They were able to read a chart and it sounded like they were just jamming. They sounded very relaxed when they were reading, and not many people can do that. And so I was able to use my session experience to be able to do things like that, which other people might not be able to do very easily, knowing which guys to book for which qualities. And the other thing was that working with people like, as I was at that time, like Bryan Ferry and John Cale, I was able to use them as inspiration for doing my own stuff. They would ask me to do things that I would never dream of doing. Can you play guitar solo in this style or play on this chord sequence? And I'd try to do my best. And I think, that's something I never thought of doing. That sounds quite good. And then I'd go home and write my own song for my own album based on that. So it was very inspirational, is want of a better word, to work with all these different people. I used to bring a lot of what I would learn and what I would get excited about to my own solo things.
Right from the beginning, the musical direction that you wanted to take with your solo work?
No. Excuse me, got a bit of a cough here. I was hoping I wasn't going to have a coughing fit in the middle of your interview. I didn't really. If you listen to the first solo albums, Only Lick I Know and Backward Progression, the Backward Progression is kind of influenced by the band and the Bob Dylan's Basement tapes, which I was really into at the time. And the Only Lick I Know was more influenced by all the different influences I was getting from different sessions I was having with people, so that it doesn't have a focus as a result. And it was done over a larger period of time. And then when I came, I had a sort of one of these sort of things where I thought, Jesus, nothing is exciting me anymore, and I sort of had to re-examine my roots after I came out of the Sharks. And I actually did a thing of looking at the charts and thinking, well, what's missing from this? The mid-1974, 75 charts. And that's when I said, I know what's missing from this. There's none of that Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran influence. there's none of that rock and roll that started me off, you know, like the early Elvis and rockabilly type of stuff. That's when I wrote Motorbiking, to fill a gap. And for once it worked. And then having sort of got into this sort of retro genre in 1975, that's when I started doing the eponymously titled album with the car on the front, you know, that has Motorbiking on it,
yep.
Guitar Jamboree. That was kind of like a conscious attempt at a pastiche of old 60s, of late 50s, early 60s rock and roll that comes out of America. You know, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, make pants that didn't have flares in them and shoes that didn't have huge platforms in them. You know, because people were still dressing like that in the 74 and 75. Just a few. I think a year before the punk thing happened, you know, they were the only people that you could get clothes like that. So that's how I hooked up with the Sex Pistols, which is probably anticipating your next question.
Actually, no, I was going to talk about the reissue of some of your old solo stuff. I believe that's in the process of happening.
I'm trying to do that, yes, with a friend of mine. He's been trying to reissue the Best Of album that EMI put out in the early 90s. We've been sending them to people like Rhino and Ryko Disc and all those people, you know, those reissue labels. And we've been having a series of meetings with the different people, but we haven't actually got a definite deal yet, but we're still, you know, we haven't given up yet. Part of the problem is in America is I'm not really as well known in America as I am in Europe. Those records were never issued in US. They were only on import, so I didn't really get the corporate treatment over here to get pushed, you see. So as a result, I'm not quite as well known and never had a chart appearance in the US. So, but I still think there'll be a market for it.
Oh yeah.
The import sold pretty well. It's just got to find the right guy that was a fan way back when, you know. And there are a few of those around. Just got to get them in the right job. The job at, you know, one of those companies where they can sign you up.
The time you spent with Bryan Ferry was probably at a commercial peak of his career, so I guess you were playing to very much a mainstream audience. Did you find that you had to adapt your style as such to suit such an audience?
No. Talking about appealing to a mainstream audience, you know, like with the Wombles, you can't get more mainstream than that.
That's true.
I was on lots of their hit records, and it was at that time I was on lots of hit records in the mid-70s. And I was the guy that you would get. If you wanted a hit, you would get me. So I wasn't adapting at all. I was just... my style had probably got honed down to being quite an accessible commercial style. But, it was what I wanted to play. And I guess it just kind of happened. It wasn't like, I want to be the top guy and you've got to, you know... fight everybody in sight to get the gigs. It didn't happen like that. You had a phone and people called you.
Yeah.
If they didn't want to call you, they didn't call you. So I wasn't conscious of that. I was conscious of the fact that I was on a lot of successful records, and I knew that probably couldn't continue, you know, because styles change. So, you know, but you don't know what to do about it because you don't know how you got in that situation to begin with, and you don't know how to stay in that situation. I've tried changing my sound since, because of course you can't play the same sound all your life. And I tried to sort of keep a little bit up with events. Sometimes I'll hear a guitar sound on a record that I really like, and I'll try and go for that. So say, oh, that's a good sound. But that's what I always did anyway, you know. I'd listen to a record and think, oh yeah, that's a great sound, you know, and then get to a session and I'd start playing this riff, and then the producer would say, oh, you heard that record too? That's great, isn't it? Yeah, let's do. And that would become my riff. You know, later on, you know, I'd hear the original record that I got the riff from, and I'd realise that I'd actually stolen it. But you adopt these things, and it's kind of that's the way that it is. You know, even the Beatles would say to you, oh yes, we got that riff from this Motown record, or, you know, if you read their some of the books that have been written about how they came to write some of their stuff and make some of their records, which I actually find quite fascinating. Being a big fan of their records, you know, now finding out exactly how they did them and what was in their mind when they were writing certain things, you know. And same with Bob Dylan, who I I bought one of his, I think it's biography album, where he said when he was writing Like a Rolling Stone, he was thinking of Hang On Sloopy. He was right, and if you think about it, there's a similar chord sequence.
There is, yeah.
And that's what, but I don't know where Bob Dylan was being cute, you can never tell with him. But those sort of things I find fascinating, it sort of blows all your preconceptions right out the window.
Yes. Speaking of preconceptions, did you have any preconceived notions as to what was awaiting you in the States when you relocated there?
Well, yeah, I thought I'd have a little more success than I have. I didn't actually, my main goal was to have an American record deal, and to this day I haven't achieved that. The only records I've had out have been kind of independent ones, or out of Canada. So it's been kind of difficult, but I really like the lifestyle, and I like the musicians are very good here. You have to in order to get ahead, you've got to be pretty good. It's a higher standard than in Britain. The musicianship, in LA, they're all the top guys from all fields. The studio guys for the movies and the record guys. They're all really good. So it's good to have those as competition. And there's all sorts of different fields you can work in. I would probably work more if I would be live in the UK, to be quite honest. But I prefer living here. And you can live in California quite cheaply. You don't need to be doing fantastically well in order to have a great lifestyle. With your swimming pool and your jacuzzis and your, living near the beach and, have a couple of cars and, in order to do that in the UK, you have to have about double the income.
Yeah.
So it's a much easier. I don't know whether that's good or bad. Probably bad, actually. It's probably bad. It makes me not want to try harder.
Yeah. Some time as a music writer, is that right?
As a music writer?
As in journalist?
Oh, yeah. Details magazine in the mid-'80s, yeah. I used to do blindfold tests, which was inspired by Leonard Feather's blindfold test in the Downbeat, where he used to play musicians' records without telling them who it was, and then discuss it. I did that with Marianne Faithfull, with who else? Robert Gordon and John Cale, who I knew. Guy from was the lead singer of the Psychedelic Furs, Richard Butler, people like that. I did about 6 or 7 of those. And I interviewed people. I interviewed Keith Richards once. I was sent to review a concert, stuff like that. And I was credited on the masthead as the music editor, and I used to get tickets and records sent me. That was why they put me as music editor. I didn't actually do any actual editing. I used to send my pieces in to an editor, and he would edit it for me. So yes, I did have a little bit of experience of that. And I wrote a thing for Musician magazine about Elvis and Dean Martin and the links between them. There's a lot of links between them that not a lot of people dwell upon, because Dean Martin is not a very cool influence. If you were going to what's the word? Help me. Mythologicalize Elvis. Dean Martin is not so cool as somebody like Arthur Crudup or the black guys that he used to. But in actual fact, on his first interview with Sam Phillips, all he played was Dean Martin, and stuff like that.
Did that experience at all maybe change your opinion of music journalists and reviewers?
Oh, no.
No?
I was careful not to. One of the ways I was able to write about records without... You see, it's difficult for an artist who's put records out to review other records, as you could probably imagine. So I used to get around that with the blindfold test, because nobody knew what we were talking about. I actually got around that. I was actually asking other people to give their opinion, who admittedly were artists, but they would give their opinion without knowing what it was. So that was valid criticism. You see, otherwise there's a conflict of interest if I'm reviewing other people, which I was very conscious of. As a practicing musician, you can't really sort of give your opinion on other people. So I was kind of I was a special case, as it were, as a journalist. I couldn't really write about certain things I didn't want to review the latest Jeff Beck album, for instance, because I might have the latest Chris Spedding album out soon, and I didn't really want to be put in that position of having criticised somebody, my peers, so I try and avoided that.
Yeah.
I tried to avoid that, rather, to be grammatical. Yeah. So it was odd. It's quite an odd situation to be in. I thought if I ever had to write about music, I would have to write it fictionally. I'd have to write a novel and change the names, because you can't talk about people that you know and the people that are still alive, and I don't want to do it.
Just before we wind up, Chris, just talk about your live work these days. You spend much time on the road?
Yeah, I'm doing I have a band. We don't play that often because in LA you can't really get music, money to play music. So if I want to employ really good musicians, I want to be able to pay them a little bit of money, and we want to rehearse. And unless you go outside of LA, you can get money outside of LA. We're at Dogs in a Pound here, in the dog pound, and the club owners come up and say, you come and play at my club, and we all say, oh yeah, thank you. Well, we've got a place to play, so they don't pay you any money. So it's not really a viable proposition to have a working band in LA, unless you go outside of LA. So I've been trying to do a few gigs in Europe, in France. I might go back to France in a month's time, and we're looking to do some more gigs. It will help if I get this my stuff re-released, because if I get my stuff re-released, then of course there's something in the stores. I can do radio promo, and maybe the tour can get support from a record company. Then it all starts to fall into place, do that thing. But yeah, I'm into doing live stuff.
Who are the guys in your band?
Don Heffington on drums, Sheldon Comberg on bass, and Stevie Gurr on guitar. Now, we've done a couple of gigs. I've changed the bass player and drummer to the guys I just mentioned. Sheldon was the common element. So we're waiting for some more gigs to come in, and then we'll rehearse with a new band. I've jammed with this band because it's really the Stevie Gurr trio that I'm hiring as my band. He manages to play around town, a few places, and he's a really, really good guitar player. And I'm really lucky to have these guys. They're all like studio guys, and studio guys who like playing out. So I'm really lucky with being able to get them.
It's a good cross section of material from your solo work that you're playing these days.
Yeah. I'll still do guitar jamboree, which people seem to expect, and I'll do motorbiking and hurt, and I'll do let me see if I can find my set list. I've got my computer on here, so I'm looking at my set list. Yeah, there we go. Silver Bullet, I do. Roadrunner, Promised Land is a new one. It's an old Chuck Berry thing I do. Well, Women. I do a couple of Shadows things like Man of Mystery. I do Summertime Blues. Eddie Cochran. I do Catch That Train from my Car album. Gunfight, which is another instrumental. Amos Betty. Love's Made a Fool of You. I do a Gene Vincent thing called Say Mama. Love's Made a Fool of You from my Enemy Within album. Wild in the Street, Hungry Man. Stumble, which is a Freddie King instrumental. That's a brief rundown of my set.
Good cross section.
Yeah, it's mostly stuff that you'll find on a record.
Yeah.
About just maybe 4 of them I won't have recorded. Maybe I'll record them next time I get in the studio.
And after all these years, do you still find yourself learning things about the guitar that have escaped you in the past?
Well, I always look to, because it always gives me a lot of inspiration. Yeah, I find I learn things. I mean, there's a lot of really, really good guitar players around now. They're a lot better than me. But I always flatter myself that I have a certain style that people like, and even if I'm not, I can't beat Eddie Van Halen in a guitar battle, and at least I play something interesting. Yeah, I learn stuff, but I try not to sort of be too influenced by what people, new guitar players are playing, because I think I have my own style, and I should stick to that. But I shouldn't be too closed-minded as to not listen to anybody. I have to have a balance, between listening to new people and finding my own style, because it's not always easy to know what your own style is because you're so close to it,
Yeah.
So I think I have a balance of that,
And just to finish up, upcoming plans. What's on your books for the immediate future?
Immediate future is this French tour, which will be taking place the first half of November. Occasionally, when I go over to Europe, I end up doing stuff with going over to England, ring up some of my old session people. Like last time, I called up Mike Batt, and he was doing something. Mike Batt is a guy from the Wombles.
Yep.
And he's still very, very active he's a top producer and arranger, and he just happened to have a session with Andrew Lloyd Webber, or Lord Andrew Lloyd Webber, as we have to call him now. And he went in the studio at Abbey Road, which was nice, always nice, because it's where I first started recording with the Baton Ornaments. They still have the same studio, exactly the same. Room is different, but the actual room where you play is exactly the same. And we're doing some sessions there with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, which is nice. So I brought back the old times, the old days at Abbey Road with a symphony orchestra. And that was nice. I did do a couple of sessions for Bryan Ferry about 3 or 4 years ago, and I don't think they've come out. But I hear that he's got something coming out, and he's coming to America, and he's going to be doing something again. So maybe what I did with him will come out. I don't know. I'm not in touch with him, so I don't know. But I shall look out for his new record and see whether the song I played with him is actually on there. And if my part is still on there, because he's been making this record for years, he probably had any number of guitar players in there to try out, and they just pick what they wanted. So, I still do a few sessions, and I'd still look to do, tours and stuff. So that's it.
Terrific. Okay, Chris, look, I want to thank you for your time.
Okay.
Thanks for all that wonderful music over the years. Best of luck with those reissues. We'll keep our fingers crossed they get out there.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll hear some new work from you too in the near future.
I hope so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks again for your time.
Bye.
Take care.